Hello everyone, thanks for coming along to our session. My job today, or for the start of this, is to introduce the other speakers a little bit more, which I'll do shortly, but also to explain what we want to talk about today. Just while that's coming up, yesterday morning we heard some very interesting discussions from a number of speakers, which I think ties in a little bit with what we wanted to talk about today. And that was in the innovation plenary session, and it included discussions about technology primarily, and about how changes in technology had changed workplaces. And there were some discussions about what work might look like in the future. And so I just wanted to share with you a couple of the points that I made during those talks. Firstly, Tim Dunlop commented that technology can free us up to think about other things rather than worrying about basic repetitive tasks. But he really cautioned that you've got to manage this technology, and he also suggested that what was important was what he described as soft skills. Also in relation to technology, Tim shared a statistic that I thought was quite interesting, that 54% of Wi-Fi use on public transport, and I think it was a study that was done in the UK, was actually work-related. And for me, it was a stark reminder of just how blurred the lines are between people's work and also leisure. Then there was a panel discussion about what a future workplace might look like. Diana Smith-Gander said that it needed human interaction. David Thodey said it needed inclusion and diversity. And Tim Dunlop offered that it needed human-centred soft skills in a diverse workforce. Finally, David commented on the importance of bringing one's humanity to the work rather than leaving it at home. And Diana commented in relation to well-being that it's not just about providing yoga, it's actually thinking about what employees do, what their tasks are. And both those last points really resonated with me, because I think we talk about technology and changing technology, but really things like empathy and understanding are timeless values. And so in our discussion today about the modern workplace, we just wanted to, I suppose, go through those a little bit more. Firstly, Fred's going to talk about what a traditional workplace looked like and how it's changed. And Rosie's then going to present some scenarios which we're going to discuss. You've got a handout there, so I'd really encourage you to have a read of those scenarios if you can. We'll go through them, but we do really want people to be engaged in that discussion with us. So please, as I say, have a look through the handout. Feel free at that stage to ask questions, raise issues. If you've got any other scenarios that you want to throw up, we'd be happy to deal with them. But we'd also be happy to speak to anyone after the presentation. We'll be at the Moray and Agnew booth, so please come and visit us. Say hello. We're near the Comcare booth, and if you've got any questions that you want to ask them, feel free. So on that note, I'll hand over to Fred.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? G'day to the digital audience. How are you? Come on. No. Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Fred Cicchini. I'm a psychologist. I spent many years in the OC rehab field. I left. In the immortal words of Al Pacino, they dragged me back in. That's not a bad Pacino, thank you very much. And I'm here today for the first time to frame a discussion. Nothing to sell, no paid advertising here. It's really cool and quite liberating. I want to ask you a question to begin with. I want to start, it's just prior to lunch and the blood sugar's dropping, but the heart should be pumping. So I want you to do me a favour. I want you to stand up if you've ever believed that you are lucky to have a job or privileged to be in work. Stand up for me. Fantastic. Now just sway from side to side. It's not relevant. It's an abuse of power. I can't stop myself. Take a seat. But it's interesting. We have this belief. It's a remarkable belief. Where do I point this thing to make it work?
You go on the arrow.
Go on the arrow?
Right. Do you want me to do it?
Yeah, that'd be great. It's interesting that we have that belief. That belief comes from history, not from reality, perception. It comes from global conflict, World War I, World War II, Great Depressions. This concept that the world of work for us is an absolute privilege and it's about good fortune. Whilst it's still relevant, it doesn't necessarily reflect what the world of work is now. When the slide comes up, there's a traditional view of work that says, in Australia in particular, it's a fair exchange of effort for company goals. You get paid to do a good job. A good day's worth of work for a good day's worth of pay. How many people still believe that that's true today? It's sort of changing a bit, isn't it? I believe there's one you can go to the next one for me. I believe there's one fundamental aspect of this that's still true today. We'll just flick to the next slide, please, Rosie. Thank you. I didn't realise I have two lawyers sitting next to me and I get to say more than not guilty. How good's that?
We're at your beck and call.
At my beck and call. I deserve no less. We understand, if you look at the Australian Human Resource Institute website, they've done a meta-analysis of what attracts people to the world of work now. I still believe there's a very Australian value, something that we can be proud of, that fair exchange still exists in our worldview about work. But the definition of fair exchange is changing. Whether it's because we have generations now that don't know that deprivation, whether it's because employers know that there's a war for talent, and essentially you've got to be seen to be fair, to be competitive and attractive, whether it's because as employees we're consuming our careers differently, or it may be because the government understands that healthy citizens make good economic sense. I also believe the government certainly understands that when you take the obligation for health for its citizens and push it down to employers, that certainly makes good economic sense. So we have in front of us what the modern workplace exchange looks like. Now, when we put words like well-being, belonging, let me pick another one, flexibility. How many HR professionals in the room? Show of hands. What do those words mean? I'm a psychologist. Even I don't know what that is. They said to me, you've got to speak on well-being. I said, well, I'm the, example of perfect human fitness. I'll be fine with that. Why are you laughing about that? That's really insensitive. My God, what sort of crowd is... Anyway. But there are elements of this that we need to understand. I believe in words like well-being now. Autonomy, flexibility, definitely belonging. There is this concept that you are obligated to look after my psychological well-being. That is the implied social contract now. What does that mean, though? We certainly understand that psychological wellbeing in Australia is a massive movement at the moment. King's College 5 years ago did a study. They surveyed 3,500 Australians. Not a big sample size, but it's a sample size. Psychological health came third behind the economy and the environment as a concern for modern Australians. Former Australian of the Year, Pat McGorry, one of the most brilliant minds in mental health that you will ever meet, and what an advocate, has put the cost of mental health on the public purse just behind cardiac disease and cancer treatment. These things matter to us. And why work? Well, we spend up to a third or 45% of our waking hours from the ages of 18 to 65 at work. So whilst, and as a psychologist, I don't always believe work is a forum for mental health issues, it's certainly the field that many of these things will manifest on. And Australians are about fair, that fair exchange. So it has bubbled up as one of these most prominent topics that we talk about. Who's seen the Victorian WorkSafe ads that recently came out? Show of hands. Fantastic. Anybody from Vic WorkSafe here, we're in your state, we'll check them out before we go, I promise. But it's gone from get home safe and alive to get home safe and well and psychologically well. And why wouldn't it? At the end of the day, we understand that our obligation to a broader lifestyle is to have the bandwidth to engage family, to engage other health goals, all these sorts of really pertinent, superordinate wellness goals that we now have tie into psychological well-being. I'm very lucky today. I don't have to explain how we do this. I just have to frame the argument. But what I find remarkable is that with this new expectation, the world of work changes. Just give me the next one, please, Rosie. Thank you. We know that the magnitude of change for our future is really, really profound. This is what the world of work is looking like. Once upon a time, anybody here ever really worked 9 to 5? I think that's a myth, don't you? I think it's a Dolly Parton song and a myth, I really do. Should I break into a few but no?
No.
The reality is work used to be 9 to 5, but now it's anywhere. It used to be where you go, now it's everywhere. It used to be what they gave you. Anybody remember the first laptop you were given at work? Show of hands. And did you feel important? Did you feel powerful? I remember I got my first laptop and got on my first flight and I thought I had arrived. I did. It was Melbourne. I've done that trip about 1 million times since. 25 years later, the shine's really sort of worn off. But we know that there are aspects of work that are changing. We have a generation that don't want to be measured on a job description, but on outcomes. We have people specifically that don't want to communicate on technology. It's not about email to confirm communication anymore. They want to collaborate. I was taking some notes on my iPad, and there's a button that says, do you want to collaborate with others on this? And I thought, my God, all I'd have to do is push that button and somebody else can give me an opinion I don't need or want. Why is that funny? Is that just me or no? I think the biggest element of what we're looking at the moment is this concept of how teams are changing. How many people here work in virtual teams or have digital audiences or people that aren't necessarily in the same room, but put them up loud and proud? Isn't that remarkable? I want to share an experience the universe provides. I believe I'm very lucky. Today there is a Coles conference here. Have you seen that? They have defined team because one of the things that we have to be mindful of when we look at the future is what we forego. Here's my take on what we have to be careful of not losing. The first is routine. How many people got up today and knew that they had to dress for work? Great. I do a lot of work with the unemployed. They don't have that thought. So routine changes. Consciousness changes. Identity changes. Connectedness. These are things that we are potentially needing to cater to. The one thing I saw today that I thought this is important for my presentation, tribe matters. And if you look at that Coles conference, they're all wearing red. It's the tribe colour. They've all got the logo. It's the tribe's name. And on their back, they've done something really nifty and unique. They've put the states. So some are proudly New South Wales, proudly Northern Territory, proudly South Australia. And it was remarkable. From a psychological perspective, it was a feast for the eyes. There was 100 people on an escalator coming down. Sorry, that joke. If you know me, I held on to that since 9:30 this morning. I couldn't be more proud. You deserve better, you really do. But when we think about the world of work, we need to consider that fair now means flexible. But flexible has its challenges. I just want to go to my last slide and then I'm going to sit down. We understand that nowhere in our world of work do we see flexibility more than in work patterns and where people work? And I'm going to say one thing. We heard from the CSIRO. Did anybody see the CSIRO's presentation on working remotely? It's an attainable factor now. It's stuff people want. I do not want to question the productivity of working remotely. I think it's great. Okay? But I want to say this. There are challenges to the world of remote work. Not because we're not willing, not because we don't have beliefs, but we're unbuckling an infrastructure that people in this room have been cultured to believe are benefits. So there are some issues here. And when we look at those things that we need to look at, I think the one that we need to focus on most is our social contract. We're going to go through some scenarios now, and I call these today problems, about those people that might work remotely. But I want to give you a thought, and this is the scariest one ever. Okay? It's more scary than an Italian boy being mic'd up with a camera on him, a guy with a long angled lens and two lawyers next to me. Trust me. I have relatives that won't talk to me after this. Yeah, sure, it was a conference. But I want to say this. If my 4-year-old daughter today is better at navigating the internet than my 74-year-old mother is today, and that is an absolute fact. My mum still can't work out there's only one button on an iPad. It's true, the bottom button. There's the ones around the side, they don't do anything, just relax. But the reality is, if that 4-year-old is a better citizen of the internet, the information superhighway today, and she hits your workforce in 15 years, what is her take on a modern workplace going to look like? And what do we need to do to evolve to retain that humanity, that social inclusion, that contract of tribe? So we're going to take some questions after the scenarios, and I'll be down at the booth if there's more that we want to talk about. I'm going to hand over to the delightful Rosie.
Oh, thank you.
For you.
I have to say it's terrifying following you, Fred. That was fabulous. I'm sorry, everyone. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a lawyer. This may not be quite as entertaining, but I'll do my best. I'm going through some scenarios that we all think actually reflect the modern workplace. At least 2 of them are fairly real to me in my work life, so I know that they do reflect the reality that I'm seeing. Scenario 1, I'm not going to read through it all. I'm going to give you the salient points, and I think most people should have a handout, and if anyone wants one, there's some down the front, and we can certainly email this to you. But we have the first scenario of Sam. Sam lives in Brisbane, works in Brisbane, but as a result of a restructure, the rest of his team has been made redundant, and all of their work was absorbed into the larger team in Sydney. Now, I'm from Western Australia, and I actually do see that sort of thing happen. And so you do have people who are working remotely, sometimes on their own or in very small teams. Sam stays on and decides to work from home because he sees the obvious advantages in doing so. But soon he discovers that his work has changed. Rather than being involved in really substantive project work, he finds that he's almost always allocated follow-up tasks, and to make it worse, they come through an automated workflow system. So, he's not even communicating with people about the work he's getting. He tries to raise that several times, or he does raise it several times with his supervisor, Gail, his new supervisor, who flags it as a transition issue that should resolve with time. And while Sam has been used to weekly meetings on the same day every week, now Gail feels that ad hoc meetings are a better way to go, but she often calls them at times that seem to suit her more than they actually suit Sam. And while Sam's quite keen on video conferencing and he can do that from home, Gail's not as keen on that, and she prefers to have meetings by phone. Sam starts to notice that his attitude to work's changing. His level of motivation's dropping. He starts to get some resentment towards the colleagues who are working in Sydney on the more substantive projects that he's missing out on. He's also growing increasingly frustrated with his supervisor, her lack of connection, and her tendency that's developing, which is to avoid catch-ups with him. he starts to notice things, and I realise this is perception. In our previous presentation talked about beliefs and perceptions, but he's starting to become sensitised and he's noticing things that are happening. For example, on the Teams Yammer channel, there's a lot of acknowledgement of other team members, but he doesn't seem to get a mention. There's pictures of people celebrating their birthdays at morning tea in Sydney, but he had a birthday the week before and no one even mentioned it to him at all. So, you know, he's starting to feel a bit down. He goes to his GP and lo and behold, he's told that he's anxious and depressed, and he puts in a workers' compensation claim. Now, this scenario includes things that I think if there are claim managers in the room, you would have seen and you'll continue to see, and that is that people develop a sense of isolation, a lack of connectedness with their team. They have this perceived lack of acknowledgement and recognition, and sometimes quite a strong perception of being on the outer. And I don't know if this is actually real or perceived or whatever, but it certainly is coming through in some of the cases we're seeing. And if the facts on their own were exactly as we put in this scenario, as a lawyer, I think it's hard to see how Sam's work wouldn't have contributed to a significant degree to his anxiety and depression. So I think the challenge in this scenario is probably more a management challenge than a legal challenge, is when you're managing people who are a long way away from you, how do you avoid these pitfalls? The next scenario is actually Robbie, who's also working from home, and he's been doing that successfully for a couple of years. On one occasion, he's involved in a video link with his colleagues, and his 2-year-old child comes in and wants some help with a toy, and he automatically just helps his child with the toy. And the other people who are linked in from the fixed workplace notice this. He helps his child, goes back to the meeting. Later, he becomes aware from chit-chat with a friend that the co-workers complained that it was unfair that he's paid the same as them to do, but he can look after his child while he's at home, and so he's essentially getting the same benefits for what he calls the same work, but he's avoiding childcare costs. So this is resentment on the other side of the remote worker. In this scenario, Robbie was offended and surprised, and he ended up lodging a harassment complaint. So you can see there's different perceptions on different ends. This example is perhaps my favourite one because people who know me know that I'm a bit of a dog person, and this one involves a dog. I call it the dogs to blame example. Joe was working from home and his department had signed up for September. Now, we're doing September at work and we have teams competing with each other, and you try and get as many steps as you can. And the director of the department has suggested that they think about having walking meetings because this is a way that they're going to increase their step count. Quite a good idea. Penny, quite a good idea if you are. So one Friday, Joe's working from home and he asked his manager if he could dial in to the walking meeting, and it's agreed to and it's arranged. So Joe's about to leave the house to go on this walking meeting, and he sees his dog at the door with the lead in its mouth, begging for a walk, and he just automatically puts the lead on and thinks, you know, what does it matter, I'll take the dog for the walk. And he starts walking around the suburbs with his dog. He's still involved in the meeting, it's coming close to the end, when a car backfires, the dog becomes frightened, runs, pulls hard on the lead. Joe falls over and fractures his arm. Now, for those people here who know the SRC Act, a fractured arm is a frank injury. The test is, did it occur in the course of his employment? And when he fell on the side path, Joe was involved in a meeting. So one would think this is in the course of his employment. It probably doesn't matter that the dog was at fault. So that's one scenario where the challenge may be more legal. The last scenario is similar to the dogs to blame scenario, but there's one difference which may make a difference legally. So we have Val, who's a single mother who's working from home, and one of the huge advantages for Val is that she's at home when her daughter gets home from school each day, a big advantage of working home for her. And while working one day, she's just finished in the afternoon completing and emailing off a major report. She's worked hard on it all day, and she decides to take a break. Now, on that particular day, she hadn't been feeling that well. She'd had some pain in her shoulder, and she thought that getting up and having a break might help that as well. So she does something that I've done at home when I'm working from home, and she gets up and she puts a load of washing in. But when she bends down to the washing machine, she starts to feel very ill and she collapses. And sadly, when her daughter gets home from school, she's laying on the laundry floor. Her daughter calls an ambulance, but she's passed away from a heart attack. Now, subsequently, a claim for compensation for dependency and funeral expenses was lodged on behalf of Val's daughter on the basis that her mother had suffered a frank injury that occurred in the course of her employment. There is one difference with this scenario, and that was that Val was taking a break. Now, that may make a legal difference. So you have two scenarios of people working from home which have similar occurrences but may have different, inconsistent legal results. And one of the messages I want to give as a lawyer is that one of the issues I see arising from the modern workplace is that we are working with old legislation that was drafted in the late 1980s. So that legislation was drafted to accommodate a very rigid work environment, and now we're working with very fluid work environments. But the way I see it, until we get a major political party that has a clear majority in Parliament, the Act's not going to be amended. So people who work in this area, and I know there's quite a few in the room, we're just going to have to work with this and try and make it work. And what I can see that's going to happen is we're going to get some inconsistent and some unsatisfactory legal results. And where that brings me back to is going back to the message that Brendan started off with. And that message is that really, although there's legal challenges, the managerial challenge is probably much more important, because it's accommodating that's going to really, at the moment, be the solution of the legal problems, because we want to try and stop a lot of these issues from occurring. And going back to the first message, realistically, I think it's the soft skills, it's the management skills, the interpersonal skills that are really going to lead the way in the modern workplace and are certainly going to help for the legal issues. So thank you very much for your patience with those scenarios. Any questions or any of us would be appreciated.